Hey guys, welcome back to the Readers. I hope you are having an amazing day. Let's get right into the stories. The first one is an entitled People story. What would you do if an HOA you've never joined tried fining you $100 a day on your own property? I laughed. Until they threatened a lien. So I started investigating and uncovered something they'd been using for years without permission. Do you know what happens when you cut off an HOA's little shortcut? I bought my property over a decade ago, back when this area was still considered the middle of nowhere. The land sat at the end of a long gravel road, bordered by woods on three sides and featuring a gorgeous natural slope down toward what everyone called Miller's Lake. The property was just over 2 acres, which doesn't sound like much until you're the one mowing it all summer, but I loved the privacy and the quiet. No neighbors breathing down my neck, no streetlights keeping me awake, just me and the sounds of nature. The house itself was nothing fancy, just a modest ranch-style place built in the 70s that needed some work but had good bones. I spent the first few years fixing it up, replacing the roof, updating the electrical, refinishing the hardwood floors that had been hiding under disgusting shag carpet. It was satisfying work, turning this neglected place into something I could be proud of. About 3 years after I moved in, a developer bought up a massive chunk of land on the other side of the lake and started building a planned community. One of those cookie-cutter neighborhoods where every house looks almost identical and the HOA rules are thicker than a phone book. I watched with mild interest as the construction crews cleared land, poured foundations, and eventually started putting up houses at an alarming rate. Within 2 years, there were probably 60 houses over there, all occupied by families who paid a premium to live in what the marketing materials called an exclusive lakefront community. Here's the thing, though, and this becomes important later. Their houses weren't actually on the lake. They were near the lake, sure, but there was a strip of county land between the development and the water, plus the lake itself was accessible from multiple points. My property, on the other hand, had legitimate lake frontage, about 200 feet of shoreline that came with my deed, which was one of the reasons I'd bought the place. I didn't pay much attention to the HOA people at first. They had their community, I had my property, and we were separated by the lake and a good stretch of woods. Occasionally I'd see them out on the water in their kayaks or pontoon boats, and I'd wave if they got close enough. No problems, no drama, just neighbors existing in the same general area. Then I decided to build a pool. Now, before anyone jumps down my throat about having a pool and lake access, let me explain my reasoning. The lake was great, don't get me wrong, but it was also cold, full of weeds in certain areas, and home to some aggressive geese that had decided the cove near my property was their personal territory. I wanted something I could control, a place where I could adjust the temperature, keep the water clean, and swim without worrying about what I was stepping on. Plus, I was getting older, and the idea of having a nice heated pool for my joints sounded like heaven. I did everything by the book. I called the county planning office, filled out all the necessary permits, had the soil tested, hired a licensed contractor. The whole process took about 3 months of paperwork before we even broke ground. The county inspector came out twice during construction to make sure everything met code. When it was finished, I had a beautiful 16 by 32 foot pool with a nice paver deck around it, some tasteful landscaping, and a decent fence to keep wildlife out. I'd been enjoying my pool for about 2 weeks when I got the letter. It came in a crisp white envelope with a return address from the Miller's Lake Community Association. That was the HOA for the development across the water. I remember standing at my mailbox, staring at this letter and wondering what the hell they wanted with me. I didn't live in their community. I'd been here years before they even existed. The letter was 3 pages long and written in that special kind of bureaucratic language that manages to sound both official and condescending at the same time. The gist of it was this: I had violated the community's architectural guidelines by installing a pool without prior approval from their architectural review committee. I was being fined $500 for this violation, with an additional $100 per day until I either removed the pool or brought it into compliance with their standards. I read the letter 3 times, certain I was missing something. Then I pulled out my property deed, my survey, and every piece of documentation I had about my land. I confirmed what I already knew. My property was not part of their HOA, not even close. My land had been separately deeded decades before their development was even a twinkle in some developer's eye. I called the number on the letter and got some woman who introduced herself as the HOA management company representative. I explained very calmly that there had been a mistake. I didn't live in their community and wasn't subject to their rules. She put me on hold for about 5 minutes, then came back and told me that according to their records, my property was part of the greater Millers Lake community and therefore subject to their covenants, conditions, and restrictions. I told her that was absolutely not true and that I had the deed to prove it. She suggested I take it up with their board of directors at the next meeting. I didn't go to their meeting. Instead, I wrote a detailed letter explaining that I was not a member of their HOA, never had been, and that they had no authority over my property. I included copies of my deed and survey. I thought that would be the end of it. It wasn't. 2 weeks later, I got another letter. This one informed me that my fine had now escalated to $1,900 due to continued non-compliance. They also added a new violation. Apparently, my pool fence didn't meet their aesthetic standards because it was black aluminum instead of white vinyl. This was starting to piss me off. I called a real estate attorney and paid for an hour of her time. She looked over all my documents, looked over the HOA's letters, and basically confirmed what I already knew. They had absolutely no jurisdiction over my property. She wrote them a letter on her firm's letterhead explaining this in excruciating legal detail and suggesting they cease and desist immediately. For a few weeks, I thought that had done the trick. Then I got another letter, this time threatening to place a lien on my property if I didn't pay the accumulated fines, which they now claimed were over $3,000. That's when I decided I needed to understand exactly who I was dealing with. I started doing some research into the HOA, attending their meetings as a guest, and reading through their public documents. What I discovered was that this HOA was run by a board of 5 people who took their positions way too seriously. The president was this guy who wore suits to neighborhood meetings and spoke about maintaining property values like he was running a Fortune 500 company instead of a suburban HOA. The rest of the board seemed to just go along with whatever he said. During my research phase, I also started asking questions around town. I talked to people at the county planning office, the tax assessor, and even some old-timers at the local diner who'd been around since before any of this development happened. That's when I learned something interesting. There was an old access trail that cut through my property. According to the county records, back in the 1950s, the original owner of my land had given informal permission for neighbors to use a path that crossed the back corner of the property to get to the lake. This was decades before the HOA development, back when there were only a handful of houses scattered around the area. The path had been used for generations, and over time people just assumed it was public access. But here's the critical detail: it was never a legal easement. No official paperwork was ever filed. It was just a handshake agreement between neighbors that had continued out of tradition and habit. The path started at the back of the HOA development, cut across the wooded back corner of my property for a couple hundred feet, and came out at the nicest part of the lake shoreline. After doing more digging, I realized that this path was actually the primary way the HOA residents accessed the lake. Sure, they had that strip of county land I mentioned, but it was swampy and overgrown. The path through my property was well maintained, relatively dry, and led to a much better swimming area. The HOA had even done some improvements to the path without asking me. They'd installed stepping stones, a small wooden bridge over a drainage ditch, and a couple of benches near the lake end. These people had been treating my private property like it was their own community amenity. I sat on this information for a while, trying to decide what to do with it. I'm not a naturally vengeful person. I believe in being a good neighbor and not causing problems when they can be avoided. But these HOA people had been harassing me for months over a pool that was none of their business, threatening me with bogus fines and liens, and generally making my life miserable. I decided to give them one more chance to be reasonable. I showed up at the next HOA board meeting with my attorney. It wasn't the same one I'd consulted before. This was a guy who specialized in property disputes and HOA law. He didn't come cheap, but by this point, I was committed. The meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a fancy building with a full kitchen and meeting room that the HOA had built with their dues. About 30 residents were there, plus the 5 board members sitting at a table in the front. When I walked in with my attorney, you could feel the temperature in the room drop. During the open forum section, I stood up and addressed the board. I explained once again that I was not a member of their HOA and that my property was completely separate. I had my attorney present documentation showing the property boundaries and the legal history of my deed. I asked them politely to withdraw all fines and cease any further harassment. The board president cleared his throat and said that while my property might not be technically within their platted boundaries, I was still part of the community in the broader sense, and that my pool was an eyesore that affected everyone's property values. His tone made it clear he wasn't taking my concerns seriously. He said the fines would stand and that if I didn't pay, they would pursue all legal remedies available to them. My attorney started to respond, but I put my hand on his arm and told him I'd handle it. I looked at the board president and asked him a simple question. Do you and your residents use the path that crosses my property to access the lake? He blinked at me. What path? The one at the back of your development. The one with your stepping stones and your little bridge. The one that cuts through my woods. A few people in the audience shifted uncomfortably. The board president glanced at the other board members, then said that he believed there was a public access path back there, yes. It's not public, I said. It's on my private property, and I've never given any of you permission to use it. You could have heard a pin drop in that room. One of the other board members, a woman who seemed less antagonistic than the president, spoke up. She said that the path had been there forever, that it was traditional access and that everyone in the neighborhood used it. She made it sound like I was being unreasonable for even bringing it up. I smiled at her. Tradition isn't a legal easement. I've checked with the county. There's no recorded right-of-way across my property. That path exists because previous property owners allowed it as a courtesy. But courtesies can be revoked. The board president's face was turning red. He said that if there had been continuous use for decades, that constituted a prescriptive easement, and that they had every legal right to keep using the path. My attorney jumped in at this point. He gave them a whole explanation about prescriptive easements and how permission-based use doesn't count the same way. I didn't follow all the legal terms, but basically he said that since the original owner let people use the path as a favor, they never actually earned a legal right to it. The board president's face went from red to pale, so I guess he understood it better than I did. I made them an offer right there. I told them I'd be willing to grant a formal easement for the path, properly recorded with the county, ensuring their continued access to the lake. All they had to do was withdraw all fines against me, issue a formal letter acknowledging that my property was not subject to their HOA rules, and pay for the legal fees I'd incurred defending myself, which at that point were around $4,500. The board president said they'd need to think about it and discuss it in executive session. I told him he had 1 week to respond. If I didn't hear from them with an acceptable agreement, I'd be closing the path. I didn't hear anything for 2 weeks. So I closed the path. I called around and found a fencing company that could get me on the schedule within 2 weeks. I didn't mess around with half measures. I had them install a proper 6-foot privacy fence across both ends of the path where it entered and exited my property. Good sturdy fence with locked gates. I also put up multiple no trespassing and private property signs just to make sure there was no confusion. The signs included a notice that said anyone using the path without permission would be considered trespassing, and that I'd be happy to discuss a formal easement agreement if they wanted to reach out through proper channels. The next HOA meeting, which I didn't attend but heard about later, was apparently chaos. Turns out that path wasn't just convenient for the HOA residents, it was essential. The alternative route to the lake from their development required walking almost a mile around the entire neighborhood, then cutting through that swampy county land I mentioned. What had been a pleasant 5-minute walk to the lake was now a 40-minute trek through mud and mosquitoes. The HOA residents were furious, but not at me. They were mad at the board for picking a fight with someone who held the key to their lake access. Several people apparently stood up and demanded to know why the board had been harassing a non-member about a pool instead of maintaining good relations with the person who controlled their path. The board tried to claim they were standing on principle and protecting property values, but nobody was buying it. When several residents pointed out that my pool wasn't even visible from their development and had zero impact on their lives, the board's position became even harder to defend. I got a call from a different board member 3 days after the fence went up. Not the president, but the woman who'd spoken up at the meeting. She was much more reasonable. She admitted that the board had made a mistake in pursuing fines against me and that they'd been operating on bad information. She asked if we could work something out. I told her I was willing to negotiate, but I wanted everything in writing, and I wanted the HOA to take responsibility for the situation they'd created. She said she'd talk to the board and get back to me. Another week went by. During this time, I started getting angry calls and messages from HOA residents. Some of them were polite, asking if there was any way to work things out. Others were downright hostile, calling me petty and vindictive. One guy even showed up at my door at 9 at night, demanding I unlock the gates. I told him to get off my property and contact the HOA board if he had concerns. I didn't engage with the hostile ones beyond that. I just kept referring people back to their HOA board. The thing is, I wasn't trying to be a jerk, I was just tired of being pushed around by people who thought they could extend their authority beyond its legal limits. If they'd approached me respectfully in the first place, or if they'd backed down when I provided proof that I wasn't in their HOA, none of this would have happened. The calls and messages got frequent enough that I actually had to start screening my phone. But I noticed something interesting. The pressure wasn't on me, it was on the HOA board. At one point, I drove by the neighborhood and saw a group of about 20 residents with signs standing outside the clubhouse during a board meeting. The signs said things like "Fire the board" and "Stop the power trip" and "We want lake access." Eventually, I got a formal letter from the HOA's attorney. It was beautifully written, full of legal language that essentially boiled down to a complete capitulation. They withdrew all fines, acknowledged in writing that my property was not subject to HOA rules, agreed to pay my legal fees, and requested to negotiate an easement agreement. We worked out the details over the next month. The HOA agreed to pay me a one-time fee of $15,000 for the easement, plus commit to maintaining the path and carrying liability insurance that covered any incidents that occurred on that section of my property. In exchange, I granted them a permanent easement that was properly surveyed, recorded, and made part of the official property records. The easement agreement also included a clause that said if the HOA ever attempted to assert any authority over my property again, or if they ever filed any claims, fines, or complaints against me for actions taken on my own land, the easement would be immediately revoked. My attorney loved that clause. I also negotiated something else into the agreement, an apology. Not a personal apology from the board members, but a formal letter of apology from the HOA to be included in their monthly newsletter, acknowledging that they'd made an error in claiming jurisdiction over non-member property and apologizing for any inconvenience caused. They fought me on this one, but I held firm. I wanted everyone in that neighborhood to know exactly what had happened. A few weeks later, one of the reasonable HOA residents I'd chatted with dropped a copy of their newsletter in my mailbox with a sticky note that said, "You'll want to see page 2. The apology was there, written in the smallest font they could get away with, but it was there. It outlined the entire situation in bland, corporate language, but the facts were clear. They'd been wrong, I'd been right, and they'd paid for their mistake. A few months later, I heard through the grapevine that the entire HOA board had been voted out. The residents apparently decided they wanted leadership that would focus on actual community issues instead of picking fights with non-members over imaginary pool violations. The new board actually sent me a fruit basket with a note saying they hoped to maintain a good relationship with me as a neighbor. I thought that was a nice touch. As for my pool, I still use it all the time. It is perfect. On hot summer days, I float around with a cold drink and occasionally wave to HOA residents as they walk past my property on their way to the lake. Most of them wave back now. Some have even stopped to chat over the fence, complimenting the pool and admitting they wish they could have one. I always tell them the same thing. Talk to your HOA board. Of course, given their rules, none of them can actually build pools, but that is their problem, not mine. The path through my property is still there, better maintained than ever because now the HOA is legally responsible for it. The easement is surveyed, recorded, insured, and clear. They get lake access, I get legal protection, a formal apology, reimbursement for my fees, and $15,000 for something they had been using for free. More importantly, everyone knows exactly where the HOA's authority ends. My pool is still standing, black aluminum fence and all. Properly permitted by the county, which is the only authority that actually mattered. The HOA has their path now, but only because I allowed it in writing under terms that protect my property. They tried to fine me for a pool they had no right to control. I closed the path they had no right to use. In the end, they paid me to reopen it. I would call that a win all around. The next one is a malicious compliance story. Long time lurker, but I finally have something to share that's happened within the last few months. I work as a senior graphic designer for a company for 5 years now. Originally, it was only a team of 3, a marketing manager, a marketing executive, and myself. The former 2 have since quit, and you'll find out later why. A huge part of my job is to handle a huge advertising schedule in a project management system, PMS, for which I design print digital ads for. Enter my difficult micromanaging manager. He's the VP of Sales and Marketing who's been with the company for 30 plus years. His way of quality control is to force all our marketing materials to go through an approval process in our PMS in which everyone else has to give their feedback, and only then will my manager will give the final sign-off once it reaches him. On top of that, he insists on being copied on every notification for every single step of the way. So every single ad I produced had to be sent through our PMS while tagging the product managers and proofreaders. Those individuals would then comment feedback for changes needed, or if the ad is approved, they'd mark it complete and then send it along to the next person. It would end with this micromanaging manager who'd have the final say on whether it's good to be sent out or not. Sometimes the process would be flawless as everyone would approve it the first time with no changes needed. But when it got to my manager, he'd reject it and I'd have to do it over pending his remarks. The thing with our PMS is that you can see timestamps of when people viewed updates. He's on our project board, so he gets all the updates, and he could have easily interceded earlier and let me know if changes were needed to pass his check so I'd not waste my time. But because of the way he is, he only wants to see the final drafts after everyone else sees them. Everyone else always seems to move things along in a timely fashion, but when it finally gets to my manager, he'd just let it sit and then you'd have to constantly check to see if he marked it off. When I pushed back and stated how arduous this all is, his tone-deaf reply was to have it done 3 months in advance. He also insisted that the ads I produced have to look different each time for each publication's insertion order. So after 4 years of handling all this by myself, I was barely meeting deadlines, and the quality of my work started slipping as I was making really stupid mistakes. Every few months, I would ask my manager if we're going to hire an additional designer for our department since we're doing more marketing, and every year I'd hear, "It's not in our budget right now." Things came to a head during one of my biannual reviews, where I told my manager bluntly in front of HR that we desperately needed to hire an additional designer, as there was no way for me to hit the 3 months ahead goal that he keeps parroting. He actually asked me, and I quote, "Is it typical for companies to have more than one graphic designer?" I'm dead serious. I showed how I handled everything by myself as best as I could at that point, and I was getting burnt out. For those that may ask why I stay, they compensate me very well without having to commute into a major metropolitan city. A golden handcuff situation, if you will. By the end of the meeting, my manager finally caved and gave me permission to hire an additional designer who started with us this past January. While showing him the ropes on our design systems, he told me the manager said something snarky to him along the lines of, "I never imagined having to hire 2 designers. You guys should have no problem being 3 months ahead on ads now." Are you kidding me? Over the years, I watched my manager as he hired a plethora of account executives and replacements for our department, most of whom quit within months under his watch, but he's gonna give me crap for needing 1 designer after I made things work for 4 years by myself? I was so infuriated by his comments that I decided, he wants ads done 3 months in advance? Okay, bet. I trained the new designer on our approach to the advertising schedule in the PMS and the ins and outs of the approval process, and we went to work. We both proceeded to bury my manager in notifications as we churned out ad after ad after ad, pushing items through the pipeline with my manager receiving notifications on every single update. When the tasks ended at him and we got no response, we set up automations to ping him every hour calling for his approval. We also would send detailed weekly reports stating our progress and also made it inherently clear to mention our goal was to be 3 months ahead of deadlines. By this past May, in time for one of my biannual reviews, my manager made an announcement. He announced my coworker, the marketing assistant, would be promoted to the vacant marketing manager position. Furthermore, they would now be handling the advertising schedule and be the final point person going forward. My manager also asked to have all notifications for him be removed as he didn't have the bandwidth anymore to monitor it and is taking a step back from overseeing us. We collectively broke my manager after only 5 months of doing exactly what he asked, and I've got to say things have improved greatly so far. Our new marketing manager is very laid back as we're still getting things done ahead of schedule and he is really good at what he does. We've also since hired 2 more additional employees for our department and we've been steadily growing. My newly promoted coworker recently joked with me and the junior designer about how he wanted to go over the advertising schedule for next year with our manager, but he elected to not see anything and fully trusted my coworker to handle it completely on his own. Funny how that works. The next one is an entitled People Story. My husband's mother and his aunt were gifted a pair of semi-detached houses, and they lived next door to each other for their entire lives. His mother had 2 sons. His aunt did not have any children. My husband married and moved away from the family home when he was 28. He bought a house with his then wife, and they had 2 children together. About 17 years later, they divorced, and that is when I came into the story. We married and were blessed with a daughter. We have now been married for 22 years. His brother remained in the family home and was later ordained as a priest. What my husband, whom I will call Kay from now on, did not know was that his brother, now the Reverend, and their mother had arranged for her house to be signed over to him. The idea was that when she died, he would have somewhere to live. However, before their mother passed away, the Reverend married and bought a house with his wife. When their mother died, the Reverend told Kay that the family home was his. This came as a complete shock to Kay. They had a family meeting and Kay stood up for himself. He said that since the Reverend now had a house of his own and no longer needed the family home, their mother's original intention no longer applied. At first, the Reverend agreed that they should inherit the house jointly. However, within 24 hours, he changed his mind and said the house was legally his, and he was keeping it. After that, the Reverend and Kay did not speak for quite some time. Since their mother's death, the Reverend has never lived in the house. Instead, he has rented it out for the last 18 years, and the financial gain over that time has been significant. Because the aunt had no children of her own, she told Kay that she would put things right by leaving her family home to him. As a family, we still tried to get along. Kay and I included the Reverend and his wife in family occasions and tried to move past what had happened with their mother's house. The aunt had previously made a will in 2009. Under that will, Kay would inherit half of her house, the Reverend would also inherit, and Kay's 2 children from his first marriage would inherit as well. Our daughter was not born until 2010, so she was obviously not included in that will. However, true to her word, the aunt drafted a new will in 2021. This new will stated that Kay would inherit her house, the Reverend would still inherit from her savings, and all 3 children would inherit something. Because of physical health problems, the aunt was no longer able to look after herself and went into a care home. She entrusted the Reverend with getting her new will written up and signed. The Reverend wrote it up several months later, but he never had it signed. He also had not told Kay that he had been asked to write up their aunt's new will. After the aunt died in 2022, the Reverend and Kay were going through her paperwork when Kay found the draft copy of the new will. The Reverend looked shocked when it was discovered, but even then he did not immediately say that he had been entrusted with writing it up. Because the new will had never been signed, the old will was the only legal document. It is fair to say that the Reverend gained substantially by not getting the new will signed. Kay later spoke to the Reverend about the draft. At that point, the Reverend admitted that he had been writing up the new will, but claimed he had not gotten around to having it signed. Kay and the Reverend agreed to look into a deed of variance. Then came another twist. Kay's 2 children from his first marriage were set to inherit much less under the new will than they would under the old one. Our daughter, on the other hand, was only set to inherit under the new will. The 2 older children wanted to inherit more. At this point, both of them were in their late 30s, owned houses, and were financially independent. Kay spoke to them and said they should honor their aunt's final wishes. However, they would not agree to the amount stated in the new will. The Reverend, as executor of the old will, advised them to seek legal advice. While Kay's son argued with his father about the amount he and his sister should inherit, Kay's daughter refused to discuss anything directly and said it had to go through the solicitors. Because all parties needed to agree to the deed of variance, it did not happen. The old will stood. Up to that point, all 3 children had a fantastic relationship with one another. They went shopping together, attended sporting events together, and Kay's son spent Christmas and Boxing Day with us every year because he always wanted to be with us during that special time. The legal will was executed. The 2 older children inherited a substantial amount. The Reverend gained significantly more financially. Our daughter inherited nothing. This created another family rift, this time involving the children as well. After a few months, Kay messaged the Reverend and his 2 older children to ask whether they had considered their half-sister and niece. All of them ignored him. We went to see the Reverend to see if the mess could be sorted out and to try to get some answers about why he did not get the new will signed. The family rift could have been avoided if he had done what the aunt asked. The Reverend said he did not want to reconcile with his brother and claimed that the aunt's new will was just scribbles anyway. But if that was true, why did he write up the new will at all? Why did he even entertain the idea of a deed of variance? We contacted the church because surely the church could not condone the actions of one of its priests. The church suggested that the Reverend and Kay could sit down with a minister acting as an honest broker to discuss the situation. Kay messaged the Reverend to start that process, but the Reverend ignored him. So, thank you for reading this story. We have tried to process everything, but we are struggling. I believe my brother-in-law, the Reverend, has been unfair from the beginning, starting with the situation involving their mother's house. He knew it was unfair that he inherited the whole house when he no longer needed it, but he kept it anyway. As with many things in life, money changes people. I also do not believe he has been honest with his brother throughout this process. By failing to have the new will signed, he created an even bigger rift in the family. We did try to give him a chance to sit down and sort things out, but he has now refused twice. I believe that is because he knows he cannot defend or justify his actions. When I ask whether the Reverend has had his cake and eaten it too, I mean this. He has taken the money and there may not be much we can do about that now. But he is still standing in the pulpit, preaching family values, reconciliation, remorse, honesty, and loyalty, while showing none of those things in his personal life. Should he still be allowed to preach those values? I am at a complete loss. My husband has since been diagnosed with dementia. Thankfully, he is doing okay at the moment, but I would really like him to have some closure on this family situation somehow. Anyway, thank you for watching.